Hi. I'm going to talk about mental health, which is sort of a departure. We're not talking about like computery bits, but sort of those gooey, wet things like brains and fuzzy, squishy things like emotions. So I thought, oh, this is sort of a bit of yak shaving, and then I realized there's two definitions for yak shaving, and I didn't know this happened at all, and they diverged to mean the opposite things. So the original definition is all those little bits you have to do to accomplish the main task at hand, but they don't seem related. And this is where I'm talking about it. So mental health is sort of that yak shaving for everything we do. It affects everything we work on, whether we work on Kubernetes, which probably contributes to mental health issues, or not. Like, this is still the thing that we care about. How do we actually function and interact with it? And anyway, that's a Highland cow and not a yak, so it doesn't matter. So I'm Aaron Aldrich. If you find me on the internet, I probably look like that picture, which is an amazing gift from the internet. This is my contact stuff. I will have these slides up on that noticed link at the bottom, and I'll tweet them out later as well. But I'd love it if you share feedback with me. Either any of these means is great. And I work at Elastic, I guess I should mention that, but it's also on the next slide. So before we go too far, I want to do some brief shout outs to a couple organizations. There's Open Sourcing Mental Illness, can be found at osmehelp.org. They do a lot of research and care deeply about mental health, especially amongst tech workers. They've done some of the more extensive surveys as far as we know on that group. It tends not to be a group as an individual profession that gets a lot of focus and research done around mental health, and so they've done some of the bigger surveys that have happened there. And I have to mention Elastic because they care enough that I can come out and talk about this, and I'm not talking about something directly related to that, and that's kind of awesome. I really appreciate that from them. It also happens to be National Suicide Prevention Month, so this is convenient. That is all of September. Worldwide Suicide Prevention Day is September 10th. This whole week is a particular focus on suicide prevention. And in that regard, if you are ever struggling with anything, these two hotlines exist that you can call them or text them at any time of day, and someone is available to respond to you. So yeah, please take pictures of this slide and share it over Twitter. All right, the most important part of any mental health talk is the disclaimer. I am not a medical professional. I don't work in mental health professionally, turns out. These stories are mine, and they relate to my personal experience and what's worked for me. It may be helpful for you. I hope it is. But it is not medical advice. I will deal with some mental health issues and talk about them. I shouldn't go too deep into things like intrusive thoughts or suicide, so I hope it's not something that you need to leave for, but I don't know your thresholds. Please be responsible for your health as well. If there's a reason you need to leave the room, I won't be offended. Okay, that's out of the way. So for me, the mental health issue, the thing you can't see has to do with ADHD. And this GIF, I think, is sufficiently distracting to begin the conversation about it. It's not entirely what it looks like, and I think this is sort of the conception of ADHD is, right, that hyperactivity, that distractibility, that, ooh, squirrel, look over there, or look, shiny jacket hiding in the corner. But it's not exactly what it is. So like anything, there's a chemical imbalance that happens. There's things going on below the surface. And so part of what I want to do is talk a little bit about that to dispel some of the myths and help understand where it's coming from. So largely it's a dopamine deficiency. This is what happens with ADHD. This chemical isn't working properly in our brains. Don't have enough of it usually. And that contributes primarily to working memory. So like being able to hold information in your head as you're doing lots of tasks doesn't work correctly for me. That's a challenge sometimes with like object permanence where I'm like, I know I was holding my slide clicker earlier and now I am not holding it and I don't know what happened in between, but I need to find it somewhere. So that's a thing that occurs, which is great. And this also has to play with executive function. This is largely what manifests all of these symptoms is the executive function aspects of it. Executive function controls things like wandering attention. This isn't a bad thing. This is sort of that part of your brain that pays attention to all the background noise. And when it's regulated properly, it can very easily say, no, this isn't important, continue working on what you're working on. No, this isn't important, continue working on what you're working on. And I tend to be like, ooh, that seems interesting. Oh, this is very important over here. Well, how about that one? So it's harder to focus on a single task when there's background noise or other things happening or, say, conversations from coworkers happening right over your shoulder. It becomes very difficult to focus on what you're actually working on because that wandering attention keeps popping up. Probably very useful early on from an evolutionary standpoint. If you're like out in the wild trying to procure food, you can be like, hey, I think there might be a lion here. I should pay attention to these noises. Less useful in an office setting. Also deals with impulse control. So that part of you that says like, hey, you know that idea that you just had? Maybe you should think that through to the possible outcomes before just doing that thing. Doesn't work all the time. So folks with ADHD, it's not necessarily that they're distractible and hyperactive, it's that impulse control aspect is not poor impulse control. That's what it is. So when you have an idea, it's not something that you have an idea and be like, this would be an inappropriate activity right now. Kids especially tend to be like, I'm gonna go run around, that seems great. Emotional regulation is a part of it, which can be a challenge. It tends to shift towards all or nothing thinking. That all or nothing bias tends to affect emotions as well. Folks generally with, and a lot of this is generalizations. Your symptoms and what affects you would vary with this, but you don't have that slow ramp up. You tend not to be like, oh, I'm a little bit sad by this. Things can come up very suddenly and very intensely. Which is difficult if you're having, say, an emotional, frustrating meeting sometime in the workplace. That can be a bad time for emotional dysregulation to show up. Sense of time. I actually really meant to set a stopwatch when I started. Maybe I'll set it now and I'll just like subtract 5 minutes. Because like I'm really good at now and not now, but not so much how long is 5 minutes or 30 minutes or how long is this talk supposed to be anyway? Yeah, sense of time is a problem for that. And hyperfocus can be a challenge as well. So this is that weird thing where a lot of ADHD folks get labeled as lazy, especially early on, because you can't seem to get your homework done, but you played Pokemon for like 8 hours straight? That is ridiculous. Why? And that's what it is, this thing that creates the right stimulation and feedback loops and dopamine hits that you need in the right way. You can laser focus on those things, especially if it's really interesting. It can be useful if you can manage to focus on your work for like 8 hours straight. Not so useful if it's, you know, Pokemon or Final Fantasy or the really deep like Wikipedia hole where I was definitely starting to book a flight for a conference. I've learned all about how sewing machines work. Turns out it's a lock stitch, not a running stitch that they use, and now I know how that functions. So yeah, great. I did eventually book the flight, but it was 2 hours later and I had to refresh the page 3 times. I retweeted this recently. This is actually a really interesting thing that is absolutely what describes my entire school life. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about this as well, because it applies to more than just ADHD. It's just that folks with ADHD tend to experience this a lot. Because there's a task, especially long-term tasks are hard to start, you tend to put it off because you have a lot of feelings about it, a lot of emotions that get drummed up just starting a task that you know will be hard for you. It feels hard even beginning it. And so you put it off as long as you can, saying, I've got 3 weeks to get this done. It's still 2 weeks, I could totally do it. It's a week. Oh no, that's tomorrow. So you panic, you finally start something, you do go in rabbit holes on one detail like, hey, build an entire slide deck. Yeah, but if only I could get the formatting correct on the title slide, I really could get past this. You rabbit hole on things, you know, yes, stress out now because I've spent an hour trying to work on the formatting here that's really not all that important, and now I've wasted that hour. I've stayed up all night working on things before for work and for school in the past. You do eventually get it done. You usually do pretty well because you tend to focus a lot on perfectionism, so you care deeply about how well it comes off. And then you feel terrible because you just burned yourself out in one night. And then let's do it again next time. So what does this deal with? This is an interesting phenomenon that I heard explained really well on that video stayed on the internet. YouTube, that's the one. There's a how-to ADHD channel that's really awesome. I'm completely blanking on the name of the creator for that, but she had a couple videos that talked about this concept called the wall of awful. This is a thing that we all have, but folks with ADHD tend to have more of these and tend to build higher walls around tasks that we encounter. This is sort of that concept where if you've ever tried to do something and failed, it becomes harder to do that thing a second time, because that failure brick gets put in your wall, and your emotions around that failure, like shame, and maybe you disappointed someone, or maybe you think you might have disappointed someone, and you feel shame about that, and then you feel angry that you feel shame, and then so on and so forth. So you build up this emotional barrier just to doing a task. Like for me, long-term projects are really hard. I'll talk about it a little bit more as well, but so anytime I have to do one, just starting it involves a level of emotional labor. Wall of awful, that's what we're talking about. So there's a few ways that we tend to deal with the wall of awful naturally. Two of them don't work, and one of them is unhealthy. One is we stare at it. You kind of look at this wall and say, man, that's a lot of work. There it is, not sure what I'm going to do about it, and you kind of sit in that state, staring at your wall of awful before you can begin the thing that's on the other side. And often that thing on the other side doesn't take a lot of time. It's usually really easy. Sometimes it's like, hey, I need to go pay my bill that I'm late on. But for whatever reason, it becomes difficult to start because you're late on it, because you failed to pay it last time, and so on and so forth. You can try to go around it, but unfortunately this wall is metaphorical and infinitely wide. So that never works either. This is often trying to sort of do things tangentially related or work up to it, but for me especially, I tend to end up rabbit holing somewhere else and avoiding the wall altogether, which puts things off till the last minute and creates more emotional stress. The third way is just Hulk smash through the wall. This is that adrenaline approach. So in case you were wondering, yeah, the first two don't work. You can't get through the wall. Hulk smash does work. It does in fact work to get to the point where you're so emotionally distressed that that emotion overrides the issues that you're having, and you're able to force your way through the wall. This could look like things of maybe not washing the dishes, right? And someone pesters you about it to the point where you finally go, fine, I will go do it, and maybe say things you don't mean to that person and maybe damage relationships that you have. Hulk smash is not healthy from a short-term perspective for burnout or from a long-term perspective dealing with folks in many different walks of life. What you might notice is that these three ways of dealing with this wall of awful relate to the natural instinct we have when posed with any sort of stress. Fight, flight, or freeze. Freezing is staring at it, flight is trying to go around it, and fighting is trying to force our way through. So that's the reason these aren't great or healthy responses, because now this task becomes an antagonistic and I don't want to say trauma because it's not always to that point, but it triggers that reaction, right? That stress reaction that our bodies naturally have. There are better ways to deal with the wall of awful. Unfortunately, the only two are really to climb the wall, which means actually going through the emotional labor, processing all of that stuff that you have around it before beginning your task. That's really tough. That can look like the kid who spends an hour staring at his backpack before he gets his homework out to start it, even though it's a single page of math problems, right? That could look like the emotional labor that child is going through without being able to express it in order to get to that point of doing the work that they need to do. And what we can do after we've done that is build handholds in this wall. But this takes a lot of conscious effort. This is going back and looking at what worked before, doing retrospectives on what have we actually done to get through this, what worked for us, how can we approach that the next time around, and building some routine. So yeah, this is a really interesting concept. I should have linked the videos, but I'll add them to resources when I finally publish the slides. Those two videos are great. They've given me like just understanding that this concept exists has given me a lot more perspective when I do work, and understanding why am I having such a hard time with this? Oh, I'm dealing with a wall of awful right now. Okay, I need to focus on this and understand how to get through it. And just naming problems goes a long way to helping them. So all of this about ADHD, and especially adrenaline driving, means oh, that didn't work, blown up at all. That looked way better on my computer. In case you're wondering what emojis look like full screen. Really good at on-call, right? Like, these are interrupt-driven, high-stress moments, and that becomes focusing. I have a very clear task ahead of me. I'm usually pretty good at it. So accomplishing that balance, that high-stakes stress of like, here are the 5 things going wrong, what do we do? It's like, great, I can understand this, I know the system, let me bounce around, figure out what's happening, and dive down these rabbit holes until I get something resolved. That worked really well. It's not super healthy to be dealing with like putting out fires constantly in your job, but I was pretty good at it. And then what looks like failure is, like I said, these long-term projects. When you have that deadline, like, hey, can you get to this when you have a chance? This is due, whenever, you know, it's important, it's not urgent. Like, those are really, really hard for me to wrap my head around. Like, what does that mean? When do you actually want this done by? Because this open-ended timeline could be forever, especially if my sense of time is very much now and not now. Yeah. So this is sort of the direct functions. Like, this is what my challenges are on a practical level. A lot of things also involve comorbidity with mental illness, and especially with ADHD, it tends to be depression and anxiety. These are just when you start going on those rabbit holes or either not focusing or hyper-focusing on your own issues, right? Because when you've failed enough times at doing things, suddenly it becomes really hard to be like, I am struggling with this differently, as opposed to comparing yourself to everyone else and saying, maybe I am just lazy or a failure, and maybe I can't just do this. And it becomes turned inward. That can create this depression or this anxiety about accomplishing tasks that you have to do. This was a real challenge for me, and the biggest thing about my particular situation is I didn't even have a label of ADHD until I got much older, maybe 3 or 5 years ago, that it even became a possibility for me. So I had to struggle with this without a framework for what it could cause, and so that self-worth ascribing to my ability to accomplish tasks was doubled. So in school, right, I got by, I wasn't labeled ADHD because I was one of the smart kids, right? Like I could do the test fine, maybe not turn in the homework. Sorry to that chemistry class, but teacher was real mad at me. But I could do the work, right? I was a smart kid, so it never got labeled ADHD because I wasn't running around the classroom. I could kind of contain myself, and I could get the work done. But because so much of my identity was around being able to accomplish things easily, being the smart kid, getting to college was a real challenge. When I sort of lost that forced structure of high school, of like, be there at this time, go to these classes, go home. That's really great for compartmentalizing my life and what I had to do. When it was like, these classes are at a time, good luck in between, do whatever you think is right. I never had that training to deal with it, because I never had to work hard before that. So I got depressed, stopped going to classes, dropped out, decided that it was obviously the school's problem and I should try a different school where I know more people. Turns out I was wrong. Did that twice, got depressed, didn't go anywhere, stayed in my room, dropped out again. Fortunately, I was halfway decent at technology and they paid me to work on things instead of having to go through college a third time. So that was where I went with that. Anxiety wasn't even something I thought of until recently as well, and it's been as I work in a community team, which means I'm doing a lot more like open-ended stuff as opposed to that ops fire outputting. Firefighting, that's the word. So without that obvious, like, this is the task in front of me thing, I've had to stretch those skills that I'm not good at. And so I've had those moments where I know I need to get work done and I haven't done enough and I know my deadlines are approaching. And that's been a challenge that I've had to deal with. And I think this affects us, especially in a tech industry, especially in an intellectual industry where a lot of our labor isn't physical, but there's a lot of mental labor that goes into it. And so when there's a defect in that mental process, it can ascribe directly to what we feel about our self-worth and directly about what we feel about how we can do work. It does for me. I think it applies to other people as well. And the interesting thing is in the surveys that have been done, there seems to be a prevalence of mental illness in the tech industry as well. This was an interesting survey that had been done from a few groups. So the instance of severe mental illness, and this was from National Institute of Mental Health has done this survey across the US. About 5% of people in the US will experience severe mental illness at some point during the year. About 20%, so 1 in 5 people, period, in the US will experience some form of mental illness. It may not be severe, which means it's like enough to stop you from working or participating in life, but it doesn't become less stressful. The survey that was done in 2016 by OSME, now this is an opt-in survey about mental health in tech, so there's some caveat there that there may be selection bias. People prone to answer a survey about mental health may care more deeply and consequently probably relate to it. But that showed 42% of respondents out of about 1,600 people in the tech industry reported experiencing or being diagnosed with some mental health issue, which is astronomically larger than the national average. That's twice as much, which is really interesting. That's why I think it's important to have these conversations. So part of what's helped me with all this, working in this DevOps field and talking about things like complexity and microservices and all of these things fitting together and depending on lots of these unknowns and things we can't control, made a lot of sense to me. Like, we work on these systems that are lots of small, interconnected parts that have to communicate properly, that get acted upon by the outside of our control. And I said, oh, that's sort of like people. Because we're sort of made up of all these different parts. And whether it's abstract, like we're made up of all these experiences that we have that lead us to what we're doing, but we're acted on by other people all the time. There's a great talk from John Sowers talks about your emotional API, and he says, sorry, I hate to break it to you, but your emotional API is public. People can access that. And it's true, right? We get acted upon by outside forces. There's things that completely surprise us. And even at the very scientific level, we're a bunch of cells and atoms that have to loosely communicate and are self-healing and have to be able to talk properly for everything to work. So this sort of got me thinking a lot as I was dealing with mental health issues and thinking about DevOps, working with complex systems. I sort of had this thought of this could be related, right? These can kind of tie together. This is sort of interesting. So one of the things I thought about was observability, right? Why do I talked about this yesterday, but why do we care about observability at all, right? We want to understand what our systems, what our software is actually doing, because it's not necessarily very obvious on the outside. And the same can be true of our brains. Like, how many times have you, I don't know, seen a scene in a TV show or a movie, or someone said something to you and you had an emotional response that you were just not expecting? There can be other things going on behind the surface. So I think it's important to have some observability into what's happening inside of our brains and our bodies, and I think the metrics for this tend to be emotions, right? These kind of reveal what's happening beneath the surface for us. This is a feel wheel that was also generated by John Sowers in that talk, which I love. But remember, this is a talk about ADHD, and that's a whole lot of options for what emotions I'm feeling, and that's a little bit overwhelming for me. So I like Sachet. This is another forum that's gone around the internet, but it paints in more primary colors than the feel wheel. It breaks emotions down to 6 steps. It's one of those learning processes that when I started out doing this, it's very much stick to the rules of these 6 things. You don't quantify what emotions you're feeling, you just feel them. They're not good or bad, they simply are. It's kind of a check-in on what's actually occurring. As I've seen this get more nuanced, some of these feelings can gain more nuance, but having that broad strokes picture to start with has been awesome to have that framework. So what does a check-in look like? Part of it is grounding yourself. It's taking a deep breath, feeling what you're actually feeling, and then either saying that out loud, writing it down, or just feeling it yourself. They're great in groups because it is sort of cathartic just to explain yourself very openly to other people. When I've done these check-ins in groups, one of the things that happens is only one person talks at a time, right? This is a moment where you can check in and be heard. And so the way people can agree with that is just raising their hand and say, hey, I relate to that, right? That's an amazing moment too, when you realize you're not alone in these feelings also. So for me, I'm feeling scared. This is a really personal talk that I have to deliver, and it's always scary to do so. I haven't run it fully through because I keep changing it, and so I'm scared that I'm going to finish at the wrong time, but that's another story. I'm really excited to give it, though, too, because I think the results from talking about mental health in public forums and making this a normal thing, the results long-term can be amazing, and I'm really excited to be able to do that and to be here and be part of that. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy. That was really nice. But I'm feeling really tender, too. I have a lot of love for this community, for the DevOps community, and I always feel connected at these events. There's lots of people that I connect with while I'm here, and it's always a really happy place and a tender place for me to be. So that's a check-in. With that, I'm in. That's how it can look like. That's how it looks like in a group doing it publicly on stage, which is another level of scariness, but that's what it is. All right, so as I'm thinking about this and observability and SRE and operations things, there's another concept that comes out that I think is really important for dealing with ourselves generally, but doubly so if you have additional challenges to normal everyday life, and that's error budgeting. Largely what this says to you as a human is it's okay to get things wrong. You don't have to be right all the time. You don't need 100% uptime. It is acceptable to say, you know what? I need to go lay in bed for the next 8 hours just to recover from this. That's okay. Providing yourself the error budgets to get things wrong and know when you're getting to a crisis point. When is this failure a point where I need additional help and we need to call in a response for it? Do I need to call a therapist, a family, someone just to talk to? Understanding where it's healthy to fail and where it's dangerous is really important too. Yeah, this is just a concept that was amazing to me talking about computers. Like the first time I was like, oh, downtime can be a good thing? Interesting. How much better for humans? That's really cool. So we've talked about blameless retrospectives or blameless postmortems or blame-aware retrospectives as well, and it depends on which group you're in and whether or not you're in that open space, if you have any idea what I'm talking about right now. So how many folks have heard of blameless retrospectives or blameless postmortems generally and know what they are, not just sort of heard of it? Sort of like half of everybody? Cool. So the concept being that when you do a post-incident analysis or a postmortem on an incident, the natural inclination for us as humans is to try and find what or who caused this thing, right? We want to point a finger at that and say this is what it was, whether it was human error, which should never be the conclusion for any of your post-incident analysis ever. Also, there's no root cause, but that's a different talk. Maybe it's part of this talk, we'll see. But part of it's being blame aware. So blamelessness sort of implies that we're not gonna blame anything, and it's really hard to do. Blame aware is sort of that ability to process that response and that trigger and that blame that you have and that you feel naturally, right? You wanna point a finger at a thing, but we're gonna own that. We're gonna say, hey, even if it's yourself, right? Because part of blamelessness can't be like, hey, I screwed up, I typed this thing wrong. Like that is also not acceptable and blameless. But to be able to come forward and say, hey, you know, I feel like I really screwed this up, I typed this wrong, but I'm gonna own that, we're gonna move past it, and we're gonna look at this further. Like you can actually own that blame and put it aside, and calling it out is really important. Yeah, I'll talk about root cause. Like there's no root cause for this either, right? There's no root cause to your failures in everyday life or through mental health, just as there's no root cause to like failures in complex systems, because there's so many things happening, so many moving parts that you cannot possibly understand them all. There's no way we can say this one thing went wrong. Like the root cause to every plane crash is gravity exists, right? It's an excuse to stop looking when you say this was the problem we're going to solve. More importantly, your performance is not your value. It is okay to fail. That doesn't make you worth less than you are right now. It's how you deal with that. It's how we respond to that. It's who we are as people that we got hired for, right? You didn't get hired because you do everything 100% correctly all the time. You got hired for different reasons. If that is the reason, like you should find another job. But yeah, that is what it is. This is a concept I had a hard time with. And I think it's really easy to have a hard time with this if you grew up as the smart kid and your performance became a lot of what you found valuable. I still struggle with this. This is where the perfectionism aspect, especially of ADHD, comes out. Another aspect of all of this that ties in is managing work in progress. This was like a whole concept to me that I could do less and still be successful. This tweet happened after the first, I just made that really loud. After the first time I organized DevOps Days Hartford. I'm an organizer for that in Connecticut. I did a lot at that event. And immediately afterward, I just crashed. Like, I could not get out of bed. It's one of the first times I understood what, like, impending doom felt like. Because I just felt absolutely miserable. I literally could not get out of bed for the whole day. And I think I finally accomplished this, 11:55 p.m. That's when I accomplished these three things. But that was it. Like, because I had this overwhelming task of, you finished this thing, now you've got to go back to work, and here are all the things that are waiting for you. And I was just crushed under this all the things pressure. And so what I had to do at this point was get rid of all of the things and say, okay, what can I do what's the first thing I can do? How can I break this down to the smallest possible step? Do like a work in progress of one. Like, all right, get up. I can probably do that. Let's see if we can do that. Great, we did that. What's next? Well, you've been lying in bed all day, you were out all night, should probably shower. Okay, I can probably do that. Should brush your teeth, it's a healthy thing to do. Great, I can do that. And that was it. That's pretty much all I accomplished. I did eventually eat a meal and go back to bed, but that was it. But realizing that that meant I did something. I didn't lose the day. It was a non-zero day. It was an acceptable error budget to be able to accomplish something in that day. Was amazing, because now I successfully completed my day. I didn't do any of the work I needed to do, but I successfully completed my day. Okay, so brief recap of what I've been saying so that you get one picture slide that says all the things, and then you can look it up all later. So we are complex systems, right? Just like all the computer systems we work on. If anything, we're more complex than those because, I don't know, we're wet on the inside. I just wanted to leave you with that thought. It grosses me out every time I think of it, and I needed you to be part of that. Get yourself some observability, right? Like, you wouldn't run things in production without having any idea what's happening in them. understand how your body and your brain works and figure out some way to check in on it periodically, because you're running yourself in production every day. We don't have staging, turns out. You shouldn't have staging, but that's another story. Error budgets. Being okay to fail is huge, and it's really hard. And then give yourself grace when you do, right? Having that budget, being able to fail, and even if you go under your error budget and reach a crisis moment, you are not worth less. You have to have grace for yourself to be able to come back from that. And manage your work in progress. When things become overwhelming, like get stuff out of your to-do list as much as you can. Even if they still exist, push them away so they're not something you're thinking about on a daily basis. I have challenges like this too. I have those like ever-growing to-do lists that I like eventually have 2 pages of to-do lists and have to just throw half of it out because it's just not going to occur clearly. And all of this is about continuous improvement, right? This is the journey we talk about in DevOps. This is the journey for mental health. There's no end. There's no point where you have achieved the DevOps, hang it up, go home, we have DevOps now, we don't need you anymore. You don't achieve mental health, right? Like, this is something I work on all the time. It's something I fail at still. It's something I will be working on forever. Even for mental health issues that have medication, it doesn't solve it. It helps you work at a more normal level, but it doesn't make you better instantly. It's always a struggle and always something. And even if you're otherwise healthy, there are still continuing struggles. You don't have to like have a crisis to go to therapy, by the way. This is really good preventative maintenance. I encourage all of you to try it. And these are the resources that I found. So osmehelp.org is where you can go for some awesome community there. They have a forum as well that is less frequented recently. It was sort of more at its inception, but there are people there. Mental health first aid was mentioned before, and then I immediately added it to my slide because I said, how could I possibly forget about mental health first aid? Super important way of dealing with your friends, especially in crisis. Imagine that moment where you get the call and have no idea what to say. This can give you that training to have any idea what to do. The Emotional API website is up. John Sauer's talk is awesome. You should watch it. And let's keep talking, right? This conversation has to be okay to have in the public forum if we're going to have any real change. Let's do it in an open space today. I'll propose that later. And do it elsewhere. Do it in your offices. Do it at home. Do it with your families. Do it with your friends. Like, make this a normal conversation, and I think we can really do amazing things together. That's the end of my talk.